Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of News from a World in Flux. I'm Charlie Gardner.
I'm Clare Farrell.
And today we've got a really interesting episode talking about our food systems and the incredible vulnerability, the increasing vulnerability that our food systems face. This is a huge concern because food is not something we can really do without. And with climate change, changing geopolitics and all sorts of worrying global trends, things aren't looking good, and our existing food system, those in charge of our food systems, aren't really taking threats seriously or adapting to them. And this has sort of been thrown into quite sharp relief recently in April by the release of a memo that was published anonymously by a group of food industry insiders. And they published this memo because they're terrified by the inactivity in their industry. So tell us about it, Claire. What did they say?
Yeah, so I found this posted on LinkedIn by a kind of risk expert that I know. We can talk a little bit, I think, about what the memo is as a mode of action, because we've got the world has a lot of very frightening memos in it at this point. But importantly, it's addressed to investors, directors, owners and creditors. So it's squarely pointing this alarm at the people in industry who have the levers to pull, in theory. It is saying that the threat to food security, resilience, is not being addressed in any meaningful way. And you could, I mean, I read this and thought you could probably input many other industries, just take food out, put in energy, put in water, put in all sorts of things. It focuses a lot on the fact that what's on the table for discussion, what's in their risk reporting, what's in their corporate strategies, what's in their plans, is all stories that are not really relating to the material reality that they are working in. Ideas for things that they could do that they're not actually doing, but that they sort of nod, say, well, we could do some of these things, might be good to do.
And so they feel prepared because they have something they could do, but not actually taking any steps towards making it happen.
As a sustainability teacher, I can tell you, and I know lots of other people from the sustainability field who introduce themselves as like, hi, I'm a recovering sustainability consultant, because the agenda is all about kind of narrative and not really about making material change. That's how people experience it. But what's frightening within this that is very concisely sort of put forward is the risks to supply chains because of the material conditions. And I think, you know, when I read it, I thought, wow, this takes me back to the start of Extinction Rebellion, where we were giving a talk saying, you know, look at this information, and by the way, there are estimates on the time frame for total soil infertility in Britain, which can be an optimistic 50 years, a much less optimistic 25 or 30 years, and then probably some other people suggesting that it may be even sooner. And so, you know, this notion that we are careering ever closer to these kinds of points of no return within natural systems that we are completely dependent on.
Can I just take a moment there, sorry, to just add something on the science there for anyone that's not aware of the threats to global food production, because you mentioned disappearing soil fertility, and this is a real problem because we don't treat our agricultural soils well. But it's not just soil fertility, so it's changes to weather patterns. You know, if you don't know when it's going to rain anymore, then you don't know when to plant your crops. It's extreme weather, so droughts, obviously, floods, obviously, destroy agricultural land. But, you know, late frosts or a dry, it's not just extreme weather, but extreme weather at the wrong point in the time of the cycle of this crop. If it rains just before you harvest it, it might be ruined or whatever. It's also loss of biodiversity, so loss of crop pollinators, for example. So there's this whole suite of different natural and climatic factors that all are affecting food production. And of course, they're operate just in isolation. They're cumulative and they interact with each other. So yeah, just to say, there's a whole suite of reasons why our ability to produce food is going down.
Yeah. And, the things in here, like, there are subheadings like wishful strategy. Companies are increasingly alluding to a strategy of simply finding new sourcing regions as our current ones become untenable. I mean, this also, the language is quite stark if you actually sort of think about what that means. A failure to see systems. I mean, this is, again, these are the things that you could apply to tons of different fields, right?
But it's not just the failure to see systems. Like yes, the failure to see the complexity of it all is really worrying. But they don't even grasp the simple stuff. Like that point about wishful solutions. We'll just find, if our sources of this commodity go down, we'll just find somewhere else to source it from. And that ignores two massive realities. One, that these are global problems, so there isn't going to be another place to source it from. But two, every other competitor, every other country and every other company is also going to be looking for alternative sources of these things, and it just ignores that competition. So yes, there is this failure to see systems and failure to see complexity. But if you can't even see the really simple stuff like, oh, other companies are also going to be competing for the stuff we want to buy, then that's fucked. That's really worrying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember in 2019, we did a press conference, and it was the biggest press conference that I think we ever did with XR. And there was probably about 100 people in the room. It was absolutely packed in Soho. And there had just been this TV show with Ed Balls went out to find out how things work in the country. And he went to a port where lots of food comes in and out. And he also went to a trading desk where people trade food. And I think a lot of people don't understand that the way that we run things in terms of food trading is quite a lot like you expect to find in the city. It's like people on the phone going, buy, 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 sell, sell, sell. And overnight, there was a major drought that had happened in Spain. There was no courgettes. Bang, the price of courgettes is through the roof. So every box costs suddenly twice as much. And everyone's trying to get them from other places. And, I remember recently, we've been through certain years where you go, oh, there's no cauliflowers. Yeah. Oh, courgettes are twice as expensive. Oh, this. And I think because of the cost of living crisis, it's quite difficult to notice, because everything's shooting up in price, because everything is becoming quite complex in terms of where price rises are coming from on different commodities and different things. But we've been living through price spikes in various different sort of areas, particularly on fruit and veg and certain grains over the last few years. And I've found it really, I've just found it really heartbreaking that my personal experience of standing in front of all of those journalists, all of those people who make TV news, write in the newspapers, all of that kind of stuff. And part of the briefing that we gave to them was food systems are in threat. It's going to get a lot worse, a lot faster than you realise. Look how it runs now. It's stretched like an elastic band to almost breaking point. And these kinds of just-in-time, very fast-paced food systems can break. They can definitely snap, and definitely with terrible consequences for everybody, particularly the poorest people, obviously. And just feeling like nobody ever wants to talk to you about that stuff, and XR tried to focus on it quite a lot at the beginning. I think in that sort of 2019 into 2020 time, there was a big attempt to push food narrative, do food actions. There was going to be a feast once upon a time outside MI6, I think. The whole action got scuppered before it was possible, but the plan was to have this enormous table or picnic or something, and everybody was going to make the focus food. And the media have not been, they couldn't give a shit, basically. They were just like, who are you? Are you annoying? We're going to talk about you. We're going to talk about the movement. We're not listening to the food conversation at all. But the other thing in this, which is about like the challenge to the business model that doing anything about this represents, and then the sort of mention of, businesses needing to tell government, and this is also, you could go to many industries again with this, like businesses need to tell government, we are not capable of changing because of the rules of our game, so you have to regulate us to change the way that things happen. And even when business then, if it does, which it often doesn't, but if it does then go to the government and say, please regulate us before we destroy ourselves and you and society, and then government doesn't do anything about that, that feels to me like that's part of this, I don't know, toxic kind of stuckness of everything that you can see when you look at like the buck being passed from private to public all the time, and that takes us to another piece about food, which is this recent expose of the PR campaign against the Lancet report on food, which you told me about. So do you want to just speak about this Eat-Lancet report and what happened?
Sure, yeah. I just want to go back to that point you made about the need for about how industry or the more progressive or conscious actors within industry are asking for government regulation, because of course they can't, they have their priorities as a business. They have to stay competitive. They have to keep on top of their quarterly reports and stuff. So it's really difficult for the best ones to make that first move in a legislative world which just massively is prioritizing producing food as cheaply as possible all the time, no matter the environmental and social consequences. So we need this government action to regulate the industry, but whilst the better players in industries might be at least publicly calling for that, the worst players in industries are fighting as hard as they can to prevent this government action. And this is what happened with this Eat-Lancet report. So this was a report that was published in 2019, a huge review of our diets and the impact of diets, or the impact of food systems on the planet. And their task was basically to find out how we can feed the world without worsening climate change. And their conclusions were very obvious and simple. Like, their main suggestion was cut meat consumption in half. And in particular, this should be led by rich countries, industrial countries. And so cutting meat consumption is just a no-brainer when it comes to food systems, because something like 70% of all our land is used to grow animals or food for animals, but it only produces like 20-something% of our food. So if we were to transition to plant-based diets entirely, we could release almost 3/4 of all our agricultural land could be released. We could produce enough food for all of us, enough protein, enough everything on 1/4 of the land. That means we can return the rest of the land to nature, and that's vitally important because we need to restore nature to suck up all the extra carbon dioxide. So it's just a no-brainer. We need to shift our diets. When that report was published, though, it received a massive backlash. There was huge, all sorts of social media trolls and stuff. Twitter went mad, but there were also loads and loads of really negative articles about it in the press. There were over 500 articles tearing this report apart. Just the other week, DeSmog published a leaked document, or published excerpts from a leaked document that they'd got hold of, which highlighted a PR campaign by a company called Red Flag.
Great name.
Yeah, bit of a red flag, actually, isn't it? And they, Red Flag took funding for this campaign from an organization called the Animal Agriculture Alliance. And the Animal Agriculture Alliance is an industry body that serves to defend the industry against emerging threats. So emerging threats like government legislation. So it's not clear, the exact links between the PR campaign and individual articles are hard to prove, but over half of all the articles that were ever published on this report, or nearly half, included direct quotes from Red Flag's disinformation campaign. Like, 500 articles carrying direct quotes from the industry. And so this is, that points to a massive failing of media, that they will just publish stuff out of a press release or publish stuff out of something a think tank sent them without ever even thinking to themselves, hang on, should I really publish this when this is from an industry front group? And even if they do publish it, they never declare it. They don't state that, it's very rare that they will state the money behind this quote.
Yeah.
And there were some horrendous articles. So there was one in The Spectator which said that this was, governments trying to change people's diets by force. They said that they were trying to, the governments were trying to get poor people to eat dirt. And they called it an elitist attack on normal people. So they're trying to turn simple, basic behavioral change for climate. And don't forget, this diet wouldn't just slow climate change. It would be better for our health. It would be better socially. It would have all sorts of social benefits. And private interests turns this into a culture war issue. As a result of that backlash and the how widespread the negative sentiment against that was, that will have shaped public opinion in the UK. It will now be much harder for governments to implement policies that push us towards dietary change as a result of that. And it's just such a huge problem, the power of the vested interests, these legacy industries, industries that have to be regulated out of existence if we're to have any future. That's there's no two ways about it. We have to regulate beef, fossil fuels, aviation, all these industries out of existence. And of course, they are fighting for their survival as industries, and they are fighting dirty. So this is just an example of their efforts to change public opinion. That says nothing about their direct lobbying efforts on governments, their direct donations to particular MPs and stuff, which is a whole other branch of their political influence.
It's nice to see the Institute for Economic Affairs listed as also part of this collaborative effort.
Again, another Tufton Street think tank that exists to basically represent the interests of minority industries against our interests.
Yeah.
It's scandalous.
Well, the IEA was set up, wasn't it, by a industrial chicken farmer. So that's deep in its kind of historic legacy, I guess. But also what you've just said just reminds me of the policy exchange report that was written about Extinction Rebellion. And all of the reporting on that, on the media, cared nothing at all to mention the fact that nobody knew who paid for it, nobody knew who funded the policy exchange. The co-author, who was a copper, was actually disgraced and kicked out or left before he could get properly investigated for his practice within the Met. So, these things are just always feel to me that they're a sign for us to notice how little the kind of the liberal media class are not doing their job, pretending that they are. I mean, I remember the most extraordinary experience in part of my time in XR was definitely sitting in the press office whilst that printing press blockade action happened. And I wish we'd documented it properly, because it was pretty amazing to be able to sit there in the heart of that backlash from journalists, because obviously we had built up loads of great rapport with loads of journalists. We put on these kind of funny press conferences, which activists never normally did. They'd normally just bitch about the media and then avoid it. And instead we invited them all in and went, here's our plans, jazz hands, you know, tits and teeth, like come and have a listen to this. And they loved it. And we took people out for coffees and there was all this relationship building. And so when that happened, a lot of journalists lost their fucking mind. Like they were like, we're really important. We do a public service by stopping the newspapers. You're against free speech. This is anti-democratic. You're wrong. You're this, you're that, you're the other. But actually being able to have a reasonable discussion with any of them about the kinds of false equivalence, the sort of intentional ignorance, the lack of any attention to these kinds of things is really extraordinary. You know, like when the BBC ended up at one point with that stupid story about like whether or not you should have a referendum on net zero, like that came out of like shitty think tanks, because there was some people having a right laugh going, we just had a referendum and it was like really, and it went really well for us. So let's do that. Let's throw a referendum on the climate pitch, because that'll shut people up. That'll shake stuff to bits. And, you know, watching it creep through from like weirdo think tank into, you know, shitty GB News, into tabloids, eventually into probably the Express and the Telegraph, and then finally getting made mention on the BBC is like an extraordinary example of like how this absolute made up rubbish can be worked through their infrastructure in such a way that it becomes part of a national news story, something that ministers are hearing about, something that's in the news headlines. And you know, this is just another example of all of this machinery working super well, isn't it?
So a bullshit story gets amplified massively with no scrutiny, no critical thought as to what's behind that story. The flip side is that the real story doesn't make it out at all. And you gave a great example of that earlier. You were talking about how we've had food shortages, and you're talking about how or price increases because of food shortages, and you're talking about how it's really difficult to work out what's behind these price increases, because we've got, you know, all sorts of things and a cost of living increase and stuff. Well, that is a massive media failure and a massive failure on the part of the government. The fact is, we've had food rationing in this country because of climate change already. Some people might remember that there was, you know, a ration on broccoli. You're only allowed to get one broccoli per person or whatever, but no one knows that was because of climate change. That was because of extreme weather in Almeria in Spain and North Africa. We couldn't grow it. The same thing, you know, there's been price increases on sunflower oil, chocolate, coffee, because of global impacts on these global commodity supply chains. And yet, if it is covered at all, it's covered as a cost increase story, not as our supply chains are fucking vulnerable, we're running out of food. Like it is, you know, people, the idea of food rationing is a big thing in our culture, right? Our grandparents suffered food rationing in the war, and all of them, like since the war, yeah, the idea of there being food rationing again, it's just like, it would never happen, right? Our story since the Second World War has been one of just constant progress. Things are always getting better. Things are, you know, we're all getting wealthier, just the world's getting better all the time. The idea that we've had food rationing in this country already 2 years ago is shocking, right? It should be shocking to a lot of people. and yet nobody knows, and that's fucked up. That's really fucked up. And yet, so how do we awaken ourselves to the vulnerability of our food when the fact that we've already had rationing isn't even a story? It's tough.
Yeah. Yeah, which goes to the next point that we've got on the list about George Monbiot's article saying that the supply chain's precarious on food, and so he started stockpiling. You know, he's obviously written his book, and there's lots of debate about like lab-grown meat and what's the fermentation process. Precision fermentation, producing protein indoors without animals, blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff is, you know, hot debates around that. But in terms of just looking at risk and stability and security and things you might do about it, you know, he's saying, I've got a plan. And the plan is called stockpiling.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because I think we're all a bit reluctant to feel like a prepper, because it's, I don't know, it's a bit of an admission of defeat, isn't it? It's like, fuck, we haven't actually been able to turn this around. And I think, so prepping gets a bit of a bad reputation because it sort of seems sort of antisocial. I'm withdrawing from the struggle to look after myself. But George made the point in his article that it's not antisocial at all. It's pro-social, you know, because our government, you know, this is the terrifying thing about food insecurity. So that memo highlighted how the food industry is not doing anything to reduce vulnerability. And of course, our governments aren't doing anything to reduce vulnerability. They're not, you know, governments worldwide are not doing the things we need to do to make our food system more resilient and more robust. So, you know, they're not pushing serious action to shift away from animal agriculture. They're not pushing serious action to reduce the length of supply chains and relocalize agriculture a bit. They're not producing serious action to make sure the food that we do produce stays in the food chain rather than being turned into biofuel to power cars. They're not taking serious action to break up the monopolies of these giant food companies. They're not taking action to diversify our crops. That's something I should have mentioned before when we were talking about vulnerability. It's like we have no genetic diversity in our crops, so they're all vulnerable to emerging diseases and things. But the other thing that governments are not doing, so they're not doing all that stuff that would make our food system more sustainable and resilient. But given that they're not doing that, they should be doing stuff to help us cope with disaster if it does happen. But there are no national adaptation plans for food security, and there are no stockpiles. So we don't have food stockpiles in this country, and other countries in Europe do. And what Monbiot is saying is that if our governments don't have stockpiles, then if individual people start stockpiling in times of abundance, then that begins to serve as a bit of a national stockpile, so that when we are times of scarcity, we don't have everyone rushing to get these last small amounts of food in the market, because some people are prepared. And it's, I mean, this is a question specifically about food stockpiles, but it points to a larger, much broader trend that is that, you know, if governments aren't doing what needs to be done to keep us safe as citizens, then we have to start taking steps to do more and more ourselves. And I think we see this across the board, not just with food, but with flooding, with all sorts of issues. People are becoming very impatient with governments not doing what needs to be done and taking things more and more into their own hands. And I think we're seeing examples of that around the country, with people starting to think about how they think about their own local food systems, aren't we? Yeah,
totally. Meetings that I've been having recently with people through the Humanity Project, interestingly talking to people who run food banks and food redistribution networks and interest in those spaces around working with community power and building up local networks of resilience. There's one that I'm in touch with in Haringey called the Haringey Community Food Network, and that is like 48, I think, organisations all in just one borough are doing growing, hot food, food redistribution, food banks, all of this kind of stuff. And looking at the figures, like how much money that has saved for some of the poorest residents in Haringey, also the amount of food that is stopped from being wasted, is extraordinary. And like, you know, almost all of it is just run entirely on volunteer labour. So like there's no money behind a lot of these initiatives. It's like partly done out of mutual aid, the need that emerges. A lot of things came out of the COVID period where lots of work started to happen in a sort of even more amplified way than the food bank sort of networks already set up. But that's sort of on the one end of kind of working with people who are in very precarious personal circumstances, in great financial need, and need that kind of level of support. So those people being, you know, open to a conversation about what community assemblies could do for them to throw into the mix. So we're having that conversation. On the other end of things, where people are starting to do this work from probably a slightly more privileged position, but certainly coming from a climate background and saying we need to make our communities collapse ready, at least prepared to sort of weather the onset of the kinds of breakdown that we expect. There are people doing things. I think there's something quite similar happening in Stroud, but there's a really impressive assembly that's been set up in Hay by some people who are from the sort of climate space. And it sounds like they've had an enormous success in setting up a community assembly where the purpose is stated at the beginning. We want to find a way to collectively create food resilience for our area by 2030. And I think what they've been saying is it's not that long ago, it's like within living memory when there was food independence for their sort of area, where that little bit of the region could feed itself if it needed to. And now it totally can't. And obviously that's happened in lots of places. So the question was put for the assembly, like, how can we make ourselves food independent or food resilient, which is important as well, I think, to just note that the things that I've looked at in terms of food in a global context also say that there is a bit of an issue around the idea of food security as a topic, because when we dominate countries, poorer countries in other parts of the world, notably global south countries, the idea of food security means that you have basically set up trade arrangements with them so that you extract everything that you want and you give them back enough to make them secure, or you make sure that the food systems are set up so that they have food security, but they don't have any sovereignty over their food supply. So I suppose I'm also interested in this Hay Food Assembly because the idea of local people from the ground up saying we want to make ourselves food resilient is also, you know, in a set of circumstances where you could look at George Monbiot as like an individual sovereign who's trying to keep his household served so that he takes the pressure away from the rest of the systems at a time when food might run out. That the sort of the Hay approach, or other places where people are doing this work on food resilience for their local area, is also has much more in common with the food sovereignty kind of topic, whether or not you've got access to it, you can control it yourselves, you know, you can manage it between yourselves with this, using these models of kind of cooperation and deliberative politics and, you know, everybody being engaged in the systemic sharing of the resources, if you see what I mean. So there it seems like there's very obvious useful kind of collision between the climate conversation, the adaptation conversation, and the doing politics differently kind of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so food is a great sort of issue to coalesce around, to have these conversations. I think we were talking about this a bit in a recent episode when we were talking about what, you know, where do we go next? And I think there's an increasing trend of not so much talking about climate, but really focusing on what it means, issues that are real for people. And this, of course, is such an overdue thing, but a focus on adaptation sort of brings it more into focus a bit. I think, you know, we've spent all this time talking about climate and greenhouse gases and temperatures and distant threats and polar bears and grandchildren. And it's just like, well, yeah, it's very easy for people to think, oh, I'm too busy to deal with all of that. Once you're talking about food, and resilience and being able to produce our own food, you're not just talking about, so obviously food is an issue for absolutely everyone, not just everyone needs it, but most people love it as well. I fucking love tasty food. It's really important. So it's something that it's a huge cultural issue. People coalesce around food anyway, but it also brings in place. And people are attached to place. The region I live, the landscape around my town is really important. And because we're talking about food and we're talking about local food systems, we're talking about how am I going to eat in the future? How are people in my town going to eat? That immediately places me at the center of the discussion and makes me a really relevant person in this discussion and someone with agency. If you're just talking about my role in addressing global carbon emissions, it doesn't feel like there's something I can immediately do there. But if you're talking about my role in making sure my town can adapt to the future and people in my town can eat, it just brings it home in a way that it makes it feel real, so it's more urgent, but it also, it points the way to how you can get involved. There's an obvious place for you to get involved in a way that there isn't with other aspects of this struggle, I think. So food is a brilliant issue to bring people together around.
Yeah. I think what I'm seeing in the community organising space is that actually all over the place, people naturally go, we needed to bridge some divides, so we did it with food. So we got a bunch of people together in, let's say, like a council estate that was under threat of being knocked down. Some people organise, by the way, it's usually women, and they go round and get a bunch of mums that are all from different countries, different heritages. They all have their own food that they make. They bring people together and eat their different dishes from different places. It's amazing. People enjoy learning about each other's cultures that way. You build great relationships that way. And then similarly, the idea of all the growing projects, I think, is also a really easy way to get people to come together. And then you go to the food bank projects, and the stories I've heard from people there are like amazing class bridge building, because one of this woman that I was talking to in Haringey, she was like, I went to, obviously at one side of the borough you have Tottenham, which is, a lot of it's very, very people living in great poverty, lots of problems. Some people are quite frightened of Tottenham if you don't know London, but that's, it's got a reputation. And at the other side of the borough, you've got these, £1 million enormous houses, some of which are still intact. People live in the entire thing. They're very, very wealthy, blah, blah, blah. And so you have this, as with most London boroughs, you have this amazing sort of spread of like the very rich and the very poor, and lots of migrants. And lots of support structures in place for undocumented migrants who often arrive and go to Haringey. That's also a big thing there that I've been learning about. But this woman said, you know, we would go to these kind of rich bits of the borough to go and like get food from people who were like donating to our food bank. And we became great friends with these people who were like, there's a complete class divide, but we became really close and we built amazing relationships by dint of doing that like constructive work together of doing the project. And, you know, even she was sort of laughing about this, and I think a lot of people would go, you can't laugh at that, but she was telling me this story about going to someone's house and asking for, you know, picking up what was there, and she received a tin of smoked oysters from a woman in an enormous house who, you know, she said she was like, actually the people I'm working with and trying to provide a service for could really do with a litre of margarine, not like they don't even know what the fuck an oyster is, never mind a weird smoked one in a tin, and like nobody's probably going to want to eat this, but isn't this funny? And, you know, being able to sort of like build bridges across things in those kind of circumstances, I guess, where you're all working towards a common goal is really interesting to me, because, you know, that goes right back to, you know, early in XR when Animal Rebellion started and people were like, you can't get the vegans to sit in the road with the farmers because they all won't get on. And the idea of being able to get people enacting something together or embodying something together or eating food together, like all of these things for me, in a sort of, if you step back, the concept of the doing together, the eating together, the expressing things together, taking up space together, all of these things are like the way that you build bridges. And I've found some of the stories about food really amazing that I've been hearing recently.
It's really uplifting to hear this, and of course this bridge building work, this community building work, well, it's so critical to everything, to every aspect of adaptation. We had a big conversation about this recently. Even regardless of the direct benefits on the way people around Hay produce food, or the way people in Haringey can build safety nets about access to food, those direct benefits are only part of it. The other thing that's happened is that those efforts have built community in Hay and Haringey in a way that it wasn't there before, and that community building has massive impacts on well-being, because you don't feel isolated, you feel connected. It has massive impacts on sense of place. I'm not just, you know, these aren't just streets I happen to live in. This is my community. This is my place. And those things have direct impacts on health, not just mental health and well-being, but actual physical health. So we have a big crisis of loneliness. Loneliness is terrible for health. There's loads of research on this. If you're a lonely person and you join a community group, your chances of dying next year are cut in half.
Wow. Because
of the connection through various mechanisms. It literally has this impact on health. So just to point out that these efforts to come together around food, yes, they build resilience into our food system, but even more importantly, they start to rebuild community, which is, it's more and more, it just feels like community. It's the underpinning of everything, isn't it? And I mean, we already know that from activism. Activism is a collective effort. It's collective action. But when it comes to adaptation, it's perhaps even more so, because, well, with activism, it's collective action, but it's people coming together from different communities to carry out something that isn't necessarily rooted in place, whereas community-based action is necessarily rooted in place. And so whereas activists can come together for an action and then disperse, when communities come together, they build something solid, they build foundations that other things can be built from. And it's really heartening to see this kind of work happening more and more and more. I mean, it's always been happening, but it feels it's accelerating.
Yeah, and I think it feels also to me like that is the point of agreement between a lot of the different people who are talking about what to do next from the climate movement perspective, because you have the Lifehouse kind of mode of thinking, you have the Climate Majority Project line of work, you have...
Can you just explain this Lifehouse?
So the Lifehouse, we talked about in an earlier episode how much Gail Bradbrook has been influenced by this book, Lifehouses, and is very much a focus on how sort of mutual aid can, as a strategy, can build the kind of resilience and the support that we're going to need, because we're going into such a sort of breaking down and broken world. But then also, you know, the Climate Majority Project has got lots of stuff under its umbrella, which is about adaptation, very place-based. Humanity Project trying to do work in place to organise community assemblies, other people doing assembly work in like all of these different places. It feels to me like, you know, all of that, if you also are listening to the left, particularly Ash Sarkar saying, you know, identity politics has kind of gone too far, or it's run its course too much, and we need to get back to like actually having a different kind of conversation. There are some people saying that community is such a useful different focus to where a lot of organising in the progressive space has been so focused on identity, because sure, I could be like aligned with you on an issue, but you live 200 miles away and we talk to each other on the internet, which is fine, like we're in a community in a way, but we're not, because we don't live next door to each other and we don't have to deal with the people at the end of our road and we don't have the same problems. So, you know, the systemic analysis of what we've been doing and how it works and what it does, like you're saying, activism brings people together, but then they disperse. It just feels like there are so many points of view that are all coming in on the same sort of realisation really about this kind of place-based and community-orientated focus. And in a way, you know, this is kind of obvious when you think about the loneliness crisis and isolation being like a natural result from the success of what I would call the neoliberal project, but obviously that's not necessarily a very helpful term to use, but it, you know, the success of sort of atomizing everyone as an individual, everybody for themselves, everybody's like trying to get the most out of everybody, all of that kind of stuff. The reaction to that is surely to get together with other people, but I think in the add-on to that, which perhaps movements have felt strong on a sort of single issue like the climate or anti-racism or cuts or whatever, the add-on to that seems now to be from lots of people, and it has to be in a place with people that it carries on.
Yep. And it's no surprise that it's taken a bit of a time for that to catch on, I think, because, you know, all the forces that have led to us becoming atomized and to our societies breaking down are powerful forces. And, you know, it is easier to speak to people that agree with you rather than people that aren't as aware as you are. It is easier to send off some emails and social media messages than to have a face-to-face conversation. You know, many of us are more comfortable sitting behind a computer, unfortunately. It's not the way it should be, but we have become more comfortable communicating from behind a computer than face-to-face with people that have different priorities for us. So I think it's no surprise perhaps that we've done things that are more comfortable for us. And it sounds strange to say that for some people they might feel more comfortable going and risking arrest, blocking a road, than having difficult conversations with someone on their street that thinks differently to them. But But for many reasons it is.
I've literally had those conversations with people in the climate movement. They'll go and get nicked, but they're too scared to go and talk to a Reform voter.
Yeah. The difference, yeah. The thing is, though, is there are rewards that we don't consider. Yes, it is difficult to speak to our neighbours, but the reward for that is that we live in a community instead of living on a street. It's exciting to see it going this way, and I think I look forward to seeing more groups of people coming together as place-based groups and yeah, fighting to secure their own futures. It's not every day we get to speak about really positive things happening, so I quite like the thought of leaving it on a nice uplifting note there. So we'll see you again for another episode soon, I hope. Thanks everyone.
Leaving on a positive note. See you soon.